Today, we are going to study one of the greatest literary critics in English literature, John Dryden. He is often called the architect of English criticism because he laid the foundation for modern English literary criticism. Before Dryden, England had many great writers like Shakespeare, but there was no systematic way of explaining what makes literature good or bad. Dryden changed that. He introduced clear principles for judging poetry and drama. If Aristotle is known as the father of literary criticism, then Dryden can be called the father of practical English criticism because he adapted classical ideas to English literature. To understand Dryden, let us first understand the period in which he lived. Dryden belonged to the Restoration Age, which lasted from 1660 to 1700. The word restoration means bringing back. During this period, King Charles II returned to the English throne after many years of political conflict. With the return of the monarchy, theatres reopened, literature flourished, and writers began experimenting with new ideas. Dryden became the most influential literary figure of this age. In fact, the period is often called the Age of Dryden. Imagine a school where one teacher is so respected that everyone follows his methods. Students learn from him, other teachers admire him, and future generations continue using his ideas. Dryden played a similar role in English literature. Almost every important writer and critic after him was influenced by his thinking. The title also describes him as the architect of English criticism. Think about an architect. An architect does not simply build a house. First, the architect creates a blueprint. That blueprint becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Similarly, Dryden created the intellectual blueprint for English literary criticism. He explained how poems should be judged, what makes drama successful, how writers should balance imagination with reason, and why critics should evaluate literature fairly instead of blindly praising or condemning it. This presentation will mainly focus on three important areas of Dryden's contribution. The first is neoclassical theory. Here we will learn why Dryden admired Greek and Roman writers and why he believed literature should follow reason, order, balance, and artistic discipline. The second is satire. Dryden was one of the greatest satirical poets in English literature. Through satire, he exposed human foolishness, political corruption, and social hypocrisy. Instead of directly attacking people, he used wit, humor, and irony to teach moral lessons. The third is dramatic poesy. This refers to Dryden's famous critical work, an essay of dramatic poesy. In this work, he compares ancient and modern drama, French and English theatre, and discusses whether plays should follow strict rules or allow greater creative freedom. Even today, this essay remains one of the most important texts in English literary criticism. Finally, notice the exam insight at the bottom of the slide. For competitive examinations like UGC NET, SET, GATE, PGTRB, and MAR English entrance exams, always remember this important point. John Dryden dominated English literature between 1660 and 1700, and therefore this period is known as the Age of Dryden. Because of his immense influence on poetry, drama, and criticism, he is often described as the undisputed literary dictator of the Restoration Age. By the end of this video series, you will understand not only who John Dryden was, but also why his ideas continue to shape the way we read, analyze, and appreciate literature even after more than 300 years. Now that we have seen who John Dryden was and why his period is called the Age of Dryden, let us move to one of the most important questions asked in competitive examinations. Why is John Dryden called the father of English criticism? This title was not given to him simply because he wrote criticism. It was given because he completely changed the way English people thought about literature. Before Dryden, writers certainly expressed opinions about poetry and drama. However, these opinions were usually scattered, emotional, or based only on personal likes and dislikes. There was no organized method for studying literature. Dryden changed this completely. He began examining literature logically, comparing different writers, explaining why one work succeeds while another fails, and supporting his opinions with evidence. This is why he is remembered as the father of English criticism. Let us understand each point on this slide one by one. The pioneer. The first point says that Dryden was the first self-conscious critic in English. Now, what does self-conscious critic mean? It does not mean he was shy or nervous. It means Dryden deliberately thought about the role of a critic. He believed criticism itself was an important subject that deserved careful study. Earlier writers mainly focused on creating literature. Dryden not only wrote poems and plays but also asked important questions such as, what makes a good poem? Why do audiences enjoy certain plays? Should writers always follow ancient rules? Can modern writers improve upon classical models? These questions made criticism a separate intellectual discipline. Think of it like this. Imagine a cricket player. Most players simply play the game. But a coach studies every movement, explains techniques, compares players, and teaches others how to improve. Dryden was like that coach for literature. He studied literature instead of merely producing it. That is why he became the first true English literary critic. Now let us move to the second point. Dryden is called the founder of modern prose style. Before Dryden, English prose often sounded complicated, long-winded, and difficult to understand. Dryden introduced a style that was clear, balanced, elegant, and logical. He believed that good writing should communicate ideas clearly instead of confusing readers with unnecessary complexity. Imagine two teachers explaining the same lesson. One teacher uses difficult words, long sentences, and complicated explanations. The students become confused. Another teacher explains the same idea step by step using simple language and clear examples. Which teacher would students understand better? Obviously, the second teacher. Dryden believed literature should communicate in this clear and organized manner. Because of this contribution, later writers admired his prose immensely. In fact, Samuel Jonson praised Dryden by saying, "Here modern English prose begins." This does not mean English prose did not exist before Dryden. Rather, it means Dryden established the polished, balanced, and elegant prose style that became the model for later English writers. This quotation is extremely important for examinations. Please remember it carefully. Now let us discuss the third point. Dryden was the pioneer of historical and comparative criticism. This is one of his greatest achievements. What is historical criticism? Historical criticism means understanding literature within its own historical period. Dryden believed that every age has its own culture, language, audience, and artistic standards. Therefore, we should not judge every writer by exactly the same rules. For example, Shakespeare lived during the Elizabethan age. Dryden lived during the Restoration age. Both belonged to different historical periods with different audiences and different literary expectations. Dryden understood this difference. Now let us understand comparative criticism. Comparative criticism means comparing two or more writers, works, or literary traditions to understand their strengths and weaknesses. Dryden constantly compared Greek drama with English drama, French theatre with English theatre, ancient writers with modern writers, and Shakespeare with Ben Jonson. Instead of declaring one side absolutely right, he carefully examined the strengths of each. This balanced method made his criticism fair and intelligent. Now let us move to the second half of the slide. The approach. Dryden's critical method is described as anti-dogmatic, skeptical, and descriptive. These three words are extremely important. Let us understand each one. First, anti-dogmatic. A dogmatic critic believes, "My opinion is the only correct opinion." Dryden did not think like this. He believed literature is complex. Different works require different methods of judgment. Therefore, critics should remain open-minded. Second, skeptical. Being skeptical does not mean rejecting everything. It means questioning ideas before accepting them. Dryden examined every literary principle carefully. He never accepted rules blindly simply because famous people had said them. Third, descriptive. This is perhaps the most important quality. Instead of telling writers what they must do, Dryden first observed what successful writers actually did. This idea is beautifully summarized in the famous statement on the slide. He does not lay down rules, he discovers rules. This sentence perfectly explains Dryden's philosophy. Imagine a scientist studying nature. A scientist does not create the law of gravity. The scientist discovers it by observing nature. Similarly, Dryden believed that critics should study great literature carefully and discover the principles that naturally emerge from successful works. He did not force artificial rules upon literature. Instead, literature itself became the teacher. That is why Dryden's criticism remains practical, flexible, and relevant even today. Finally, let us revise the most important examination points from this slide. John Dryden is called the father of English criticism because he transformed criticism into a systematic discipline. He was the first self-conscious English critic, the founder of modern English prose style, and the pioneer of historical and comparative criticism. His critical approach was anti-dogmatic, skeptical, descriptive, and practical. Always remember his famous principle: he does not lay down rules, he discovers rules. And finally, never forget Samuel Johnson's memorable tribute, "Here modern English prose begins." These points are repeatedly asked in UGC NET, SET, PGTRB, GATE, and MAR English entrance examinations. Now let us move to one of the most fascinating aspects of John Dryden's life, his relationship with politics. This slide is titled, "The Political Chameleon, Context and Survival." Before we begin, let us understand the meaning of the word chameleon. A chameleon is a small lizard that changes its color according to its surroundings. Similarly, many scholars call Dryden a political chameleon because he changed his political and religious loyalties as England's rulers changed. Now, an important question arises. Did Dryden change his beliefs only for personal gain? Some critics say yes. They accuse him of being an opportunist. Other critics disagree. They argue that England during the 17th century was politically unstable. Kings were overthrown, governments changed, and religious conflicts divided the country. A writer who depended on royal patronage had to adapt in order to survive. So, before judging Dryden, we must understand the historical circumstances in which he lived. Let us now follow the timeline shown on the slide. First stage 1659, Oliver Cromwell. Our story begins in 1659. England was not ruled by a king. Instead, it was ruled by Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Puritans. The monarchy had been abolished after the English Civil War, and King Charles I had been executed. When Cromwell died in 1658, Dryden wrote a poem called Heroicae Stanzas. In this poem, Dryden praises Cromwell and honors him as a strong national leader. Notice something important. At this stage, Dryden admired Cromwell. This is the first major political position in his career. Second stage 1660, Charles II and the Restoration. Now history takes a dramatic turn. In 1660, the monarchy was restored. King Charles II returned to the throne. This event is known as the Restoration. Instead of continuing to support Cromwell's government, Dryden welcomed the return of the king. To celebrate this historic event, he wrote Astrea Redux. The title means, Justice Returns. In this poem, Dryden presents the Restoration as a time of peace, stability, and national renewal. This shows that his political writing changed with the new government. Because of his literary talent and loyalty to the Restoration monarchy, Dryden received one of the highest honors available to a writer. In 1668, he was appointed Poet Laureate. Now, what is a Poet Laureate? A Poet Laureate is the official poet of the nation. He writes poems for important national events such as royal celebrations, victories, coronations, and public ceremonies. This appointment made Dryden the leading literary voice of Restoration England. Third stage 1685, James II and conversion to Catholicism. Let us move to the next important event. In 1685, James II became king. Unlike Charles II, James II was openly Catholic. Around this time, Dryden himself converted from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. This decision became one of the most controversial moments in his life. To defend the Catholic faith, Dryden wrote one of his most famous religious poems, The Hind and the Panther. This is an allegorical poem. In this poem, the hind, a gentle female deer, represents the Roman Catholic Church, while the panther represents the Church of England. Instead of arguing through direct political speeches, Dryden used animals as symbols to explain religious ideas. This is a good example of allegory. Fourth stage 1688. William III and the Glorious Revolution. Now another political revolution changed England. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution took place. James II lost his throne, and William III became king. The new government required public officials to take an oath of loyalty. Dryden refused. Why? Because he remained loyal to James II and to the Catholic faith. As a result, he lost his important government positions, including the office of Poet Laureate. This was a major turning point in his life. Without government income, Dryden needed another way to earn money. He turned to translation. He translated the works of great classical writers such as Virgil, Juvenal, Ovid, and Persius. These translations not only helped him financially but also became masterpieces of English literature. Sometimes great literary works are born from difficult circumstances. The synthesis. Now let us read the important conclusion at the bottom of the slide. Dryden's literary career was closely connected with the political power of his time. Whenever governments changed, his career was affected. His poems often reflected the beliefs of the ruling authority. Some scholars criticize him for changing sides too often. Others believe he was simply trying to survive during one of the most politically unstable periods in English history. Both interpretations are important, and in literary studies, both are discussed. Perhaps the best way to understand Dryden is not to see him merely as an opportunist or merely as a victim, but as a writer whose life was deeply shaped by the turbulent politics of 17th century England. Examination revision. For competitive examinations, remember these important facts. 1659. Dryden wrote heroic stanzas on the death of Oliver Cromwell. 1660. He welcomed the Restoration by writing Astrea Redux. 1668. He became Poet Laureate. 1685. Under James II, Dryden converted to Roman Catholicism and wrote The Hind and the Panther. 1688. After the Glorious Revolution, he refused the oath to William III, lost his official posts, and devoted himself to translation. These events explain why John Dryden is often called the political chameleon, and show how closely literature, politics, and religion were connected during the Restoration Age. Now let us move to one of the most important intellectual influences on John Dryden. This slide is titled, The Hobbesian Foundation of Neoclassicism. To understand Dryden's literary theory, we must first understand the philosopher who greatly influenced him, Thomas Hobbes. Many students memorize Dryden's critical principles but forget where these ideas came from. The answer is simple. Many of Dryden's ideas about literature, human nature, society, and government were influenced by the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. So today, we are not only studying literature, we are also seeing how philosophy shaped literary criticism. Let us examine each section of the slide carefully. First idea, empiricism over inspiration. The first point says, empiricism over inspiration. Before understanding this phrase, let us understand the word empiricism. Empiricism means knowledge comes from experience, observation, and learning, not from mysterious supernatural inspiration. Imagine two students. The first student believes, I don't need to study. Inspiration will come during the exam. The second student studies every day, gains experience, practices writing answers, and improves little by little. Who is more likely to succeed? Obviously, the second student. That is exactly what Dryden believed about poetry. He did not think that great poetry simply falls from heaven. Instead, he believed that poetry is created through experience, careful observation, practice, judgment, and skill. That is why the slide says, poetry is a mechanical result of experience, judgment, and fancy. Now, notice the word, fancy. Today, when we hear the word, fancy, we think of imagination. But during Dryden's time, the meaning was slightly different. Fancy meant the mind's ability to arrange ideas, combine experiences, and create beautiful expressions. It was not the unlimited imagination celebrated later by romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge. Dryden believed that poetry is like building a beautiful house. A builder needs bricks, measurements, planning, and experience. Similarly, a poet needs language, observation, knowledge, judgment, and artistic skill. Poetry is not an accident. It is an art that can be learned and perfected. Second idea, human nature. Now let us move to the second idea. The slide says, human nature is naturally competitive and violent, therefore it requires strict rational control. This idea comes directly from Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes had a rather pessimistic view of human beings. He believed that if there were no laws and no government, people would constantly fight each other for power, wealth, and survival. In his famous book Leviathan, Hobbes described life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is one of the most famous quotations in political philosophy. Let us understand this with an example. Imagine a classroom without a teacher. There are no rules, no timetable, no discipline. Every student does whatever he or she wants. Some students shout, some disturb others, some refuse to study. Soon the classroom becomes chaotic. Now imagine the teacher enters the classroom. Rules are established. Everyone sits properly. Learning begins. Similarly, Hobbes believed that human beings naturally need discipline and rational control. Dryden accepted this idea. Therefore, his literary criticism values order, balance, discipline, reason, and self-control. These became the foundation of neoclassicism. Third idea, divine right and absolutism. Now let us move to the third section. The slide says, divine right and absolutism. What does this mean? According to Hobbes, society needs a powerful ruler to maintain peace. People voluntarily surrender some of their freedoms so that the ruler can protect everyone from violence and disorder. This powerful ruler is called the sovereign. The sovereign could be a king or another supreme authority. Dryden largely supported this political idea. Remember what we studied in the previous slide. Dryden admired political stability. He believed that frequent revolutions and civil wars damaged both society and literature. That is why many of his poems supported monarchy and lawful authority. Notice the quotation on the slide. Without a strong ruler, society falls into a nasty, brutish, and short state of war. This quotation again comes from Hobbes. For Dryden, political stability created the conditions necessary for art, literature, education, and culture to flourish. Fourth idea, the function of poetry. Now let us discuss the final and perhaps most important section. The slide says, the function of poetry, to instruct and delight. This principle goes back to the Roman poet Horace. Horace believed that good literature should do two things at the same time. First, it should teach something valuable. Second, it should entertain the reader. Think about your favorite teacher. If a teacher only entertains students without teaching anything, students enjoy the class but learn very little. If another teacher only lectures without making the class interesting, students become bored. The best teacher does both. The teacher explains difficult ideas clearly while also keeping students interested. Dryden believed poetry should work in exactly the same way. It should educate the mind while giving pleasure to the reader. However, Dryden made one important modification. Earlier neoclassical critics often emphasized instruction more than enjoyment. Dryden believed that readers learn better when they first enjoy the work. Therefore, he slightly shifted the balance. He argued that delight and instruction should work together, rather than making literature merely a moral lecture. This made his criticism more practical and more reader-friendly. Bringing everything together, now let us connect all four ideas. Dryden believed that poetry is not created by sudden inspiration but by experience, judgment, and artistic skill. He believed that human beings need reason and discipline because human nature is naturally competitive. He supported political order and stable government, believing that peace allows literature to flourish. Finally, he believed that the highest purpose of poetry is to delight readers while also teaching them moral and intellectual truths. These four ideas became the philosophical foundation of English neoclassicism. Examination revision. Remember these key points. Thomas Hobbes strongly influenced Dryden's neoclassical thinking. Dryden believed poetry results from experience, judgment, and fancy, not mere inspiration. Hobbes viewed human nature as naturally competitive, making reason and discipline essential. Hobbes argued that society requires a strong sovereign to maintain peace, and Dryden generally supported political stability. Dryden accepted Horace's principle that poetry should instruct and delight, but he emphasized that readers learn most effectively when literature first gives them pleasure. Understanding these philosophical foundations will help you appreciate why Dryden became one of the greatest critics of the neoclassical age.